Hello and welcome everybody to episode 6 of The Faithful and the Questioner. My name is Max. I'm joined again here by my little sister Sammy. Sammy, happy early Thanksgiving.
Woohoo!
I noticed you already had a Christmas tree in your little room there, yeah?
There it is.
Jesus.
I'm a decorate for Christmas before Thanksgiving person. And studies show that people who decorate early are happier.
I was about to say, I don't decorate before Thanksgiving, so that checks out.
Sorry to hear that.
Well, hey, maybe if I start doing that, it'll change. Who knows? But yes, happy early Thanksgiving, everyone. If that's not too political to say nowadays, but I hope it's going to be a good holiday for everyone. Yeah, happy early Christmas, even though, Sam, we are a month away from that. I hope you realize that. But yeah, Jesus is getting a little old here, about to turn 2000. Well, he's going to be a little older than 2024, right? Because he died 2024 years after his death. So he's more like 2054 years old or something.
No.
No?
I think AD is
based on his birth.
Based on his birth, yeah.
Then why is it called after death?
It's not. That's
not
actually what it stands for.
Okay. Well, we don't.
That's understandable to assume.
We don't have to go into that if you don't want to. I was trying to be a little humorous, but unless you have it ready, I'm curious. But that's.
It stands for Anno Domini, which is a Latin phrase that means "in the year of our Lord." It refers to the years after the birth of Jesus.
So we're saying that 1 AD is 1 year after
his birth. I think that's the idea.
Okay.
Probably not exact, but
whatever. That doesn't matter for the sake of this conversation. We'll get to it later because I am curious. That actually threw me off. I forgot to mention that, but in like 7th grade or something, we were talking about BC and AD, and I think somehow that conversation made me believe less in God. It was a little awkward, but we'll talk about it later. It was just a confusing topic. But anyway, as the name of this new video suggests, Sam was nice enough to gift me this good little book set by C.S. Lewis for my birthday last week. We talked about this a little bit on the podcast, but the main one we're going to focus on today is Mere Christianity. I got through that last week. And then, Sam, I mentioned to you, I just want to touch on the Screwtape Letters, but we don't have to go into too much detail there. So we can lead into this a little bit. Do you want to give us like a brief overview of C.S. Lewis? I feel like most people probably know him for the Chronicles of Narnia, right? But he's written several books on Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you want me to pull that slide up here, but he seemed like a pretty cool dude, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, super cool dude, super smart dude. I don't know all that much about him other than this book I think was published in the 50s, so he's pretty old. Born in the late 1800s, lived into the 60s, I think. And he was an author, a theologian, a teacher, and wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, which is a fictional book but has a lot of biblical themes and influence. And then lots of Christian books, including Mere Christianity, Screwtape Letters, Great Divorce, A Grief Observed, The Problem of Pain, like a ton of Christian books, as well as he has a sci-fi series. And
sci-fi series.
Yeah, Kenny would really like for you to read that. I started to read it. It was a little, I didn't quite get through it. I'm not a really good reader. So I'm disclaimer behind on these books. I read Mere Christianity and Screwtape Letters a couple years ago all the way through. I didn't completely reread them for this podcast. So just to throw that out there, Max reads things very quickly. So he read both of these books in a week. So good for him. Apparently he was also buddies with Tolkien, which is fun.
Yeah, I finally got Sam to start reading Lord of the Rings. So if we have any fellow nerds in the audience, yeah, that got my attention when he dedicated. I think he dedicated Mere Christianity kind of to J.R. Tolkien, right?
Oh, did he really?
Something like that. I might have it screwed up with Screwtape Letters, but I think it was. Yeah, it was kind of inspired by Tolkien, so that's pretty cool. I'm a pretty big Lord of the Rings / Hobbit nerd, as Sam is starting to know as she finishes up the Fellowship of the Ring. which is interesting. I didn't know Tolkien was a Christian either, and I don't think he meant for Lord of the Rings to be an allegory toward Christianity, but I think he did admit that there were some themes in there that he kind of adopted from the Bible, so that's cool. But yeah, Lewis seems like a very cool guy. Both him and Tolkien served in World War I, which I also didn't know. They fought in the trenches of France. I think slightly different periods. I don't think they actually met during the war, but they both have their own little backstory. And of course, I give a lot of credit to them for having balls of steel like that. So really, that's awesome. Cool history. Again, these are the books we'll be talking about today. So focus on Mere Christianity. Then I might just have a couple of comments on the Screwtape Letters here. So we'll get into that. But Sam, I mentioned this to you before we got started, and maybe you can dive into this. There are Christians and there are atheists, and then there are atheists that become Christians. And I generally give a lot more weight to the opinions of people who converted from atheism or being agnostic to Christianity, because they know both sides very well. So I think Lewis talked about that when in the preface of the book, he talked about his transition to Christianity a little bit. One of my holdups, despite the respect that I have for these guys, and I know we talked about this a little bit too, the book focuses more on how he views Christianity. He explains what Christians believe, as opposed to spending his time convincing non-believers. I'm just wondering if you have any comments on that, or maybe about his transition from atheism to Christian.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with what all went into his transition into Christianity. I mean, obviously, as you read his books, you can tell that he's a very intellectual, logical person. So I think certainly a part of it was that pursuit of truth and kind of getting there from a logical standpoint, and really having to put in the work to think about the why behind believing it in a way that's not just following along with it somebody's telling him is true. So I think his logical brain and his pursuits of that truth led him to Jesus. And I see what you're saying, like Mere Christianity, even the title is like, okay, boom, this is what Christians believe. This is brief as it can be explanation of the theology and the why behind it. But I do think that it contains quite a few good arguments for Christianity, or at least like the first chapter, which I did reread, is just talking about setting up a basis for religion in general. So it's talking about the law of nature and about morality, and how humanity is clearly in some way set apart from animals in the way that we were designed, and the way that we have a conscience, and where does that conscience come from, and who defines good and evil, and things like that. So go ahead.
You gotta finish your thoughts, sorry, but I want to comment on that when you're done.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say that at least the first bit talking about that morality does sort of build a foundation for religion in general. And then from that, he continues to explain why that is narrowed down for him to boil down to Christianity and his belief.
So he did talk about that, how there's kind of a moral law, and people generally know the difference between right and wrong. And if that's the fact, then there has to be some almighty moral law creator. That's a fair point. And then what I start to think about is things like, you talk about animals, like we might have a personality that separates us from animals. We're a more intelligent species. I mean, I'm probably not, but most people are. But the point that you kind of mentioned is there's an argument, and I think I mentioned this in one of our earlier episodes, that some priests or pastors or some religious people are dicks, and they'll say, oh, your dogs don't go to heaven, they're not waiting for you there. So I don't like it when people would say, and I don't think this is the point you're trying to make, but we're kind of separating people from other creatures. So, but the way you put it, the way he put it, I mean, I think it's possible for dogs to have morals. Have you seen like the cute videos of the dog sharing their treat with the cat or whatever? Some scientists have said things like, "Oh, well, dogs don't have personalities." Like, okay, well, they might have a doganality.
Yeah, there's a reason it's called a person.
They have the equivalent of a personality, right? So what I kind of mean is that I do think other animals have morals, and even though we've talked about evolution in earlier episodes and Darwinism, kill or be killed, I think some animals other than us do have kind of their own moral law there. So that's why that particular argument that he made, I struggle with a little bit. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that. Am I making sense here?
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And I think I agree with you. Animals can have personalities. Animals do have some sort of, I mean, I'm not in a dog's head. And one thing that he mentioned in the book is like, we get a unique perspective that we're not just observing humanity from the outside. We are observing it inside too. And we all know what it feels like to know that you're doing something wrong and therefore be sneaky about it, or how feelings of guilt work, even if nobody necessarily taught you those feelings and things like that. In animals, obviously you can train animals to feel guilty. You can train them what to do and not to do. There's some animals that are more communal and they share and things like that, which probably could be considered like morality, or it could just be considered instinct. And there's definitely some things that humans do that are moral, but also may like be instinct at the same time. So yeah, it's kind of like a bit of a gray argument, but I think overall, the distinguishing factor is not to lessen animals as beautiful creations that God made and making claims like they're not going to be in heaven and stuff like that. I think it's more that we are set apart in the fact that we're made in the image of God and therefore reflect his morality and therefore reflect his character, and animals are not made in the image of God. They're created, but they're not kind of comparable types of characters as humans are to their creator.
So humans, we could say, have souls, and then I don't know. I don't want to say my dog doesn't have a soul. I feel like he's a sweetie pie. But and what I'm thinking here, and I think I kind of made this argument a few episodes back, is, well, on the evolutionary timeline, humans have been around for a very short period relative to how long Earth has been around. And then one thing I've said that I think you disagree with, even though it seems logical to me, is the universe is freaking big. I think there's somewhere out there, even if there's no hope of us ever contacting them in our lifetime, I think some intelligent life exists somewhere else in the universe, and I don't think they're necessarily like us. They're not necessarily humans, but that doesn't mean they have a soul, and I don't know how Jesus would communicate if they're not created in God's image. I know I'm kind of rambling here, but I think there's a lot of other creatures that should be going to heaven that aren't just humans. Maybe I think that's part of the point I'm trying to drive home. But we say we're created in God's image when a vast majority of the living things on Earth, then by definition, would not be created in God's image.
Well, initially what you're saying about aliens and all that, I don't know. Like that's
my opinion. It feels logical, but you can disagree with me. Sure.
I see what you're saying. That is an interesting question to ask, but I feel like that is a very theoretical question that we're not that close to knowing if that's even true or not. So, but yeah, I don't really know what else to say.
No, that's okay. Well, I want to talk about a little bit more about the conversion to Christianity. And again, I give this man so much credit because he understands both sides. And of course, we mentioned he fought in the trenches in World War I, massive balls of steel for that. And then I try to understand his transition from atheism to Christianity. One point that I mentioned in the book that I made a bullet on here, let me pull it up on the screen. Here we go. So Lewis argues that Jesus' claims about himself could not be reduced to mere moral teaching.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus was either deluded, deceitful, or divine, and Lewis found the first two options to be implausible.
Mm-hmm.
And he mentioned that, say Jesus was intentionally deluded or deceitful, then he shouldn't be following his lessons anyway. He could be divine, but even we talked about how the Jews disagreed with the fact that he was the prophet, he was the son of God. So they believed he was one of the first two, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, that's a little point on Lewis's transition to Christianity, which I respect, but it seems to be more opinion-based because, well, there's not a lot of factual statements he gave behind it to say that he's divine. And again, I'm not trying to be disrespectful by saying he wasn't divine or he was one of the first two, but I don't fully understand how he gets this conclusion. He did mention that so many scriptures and books dating back between 1 AD and, early 1900 when Lewis was born, they all confirm each other, as we've kind of discussed. Like, there's more to Jesus than just the Bible. There's so much supporting evidence, so maybe that was part of it. But any further comments on there, I'm just trying to understand it better, because he's kind of sort of jumping to conclusions, in my opinion. I'm trying to understand how he got there a little bit more. And again, being, in active battle during World War I, he's seen horrors beyond my comprehension, and that's why I do try to give his opinion a lot more weight. But going from point A to point B is still what I'm struggling with.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to find the exact page where that quote comes from about Jesus being either deluded, deceitful, or divine. I see where he's coming from with that. I don't know. In my head, I don't feel like that's jumping to conclusions. And I think the reason why is because if you read the Gospels and you read about Jesus's ministry and what how he valued spending his time on earth, he wasn't aiming to be a good teacher. So, he is naturally, but that wasn't his main point on earth. And he did so much more than just say good moral things. He lived them out. He taught people, he discipled people, he sacrificed, he healed, and ultimately he died for us. And that goes way beyond just saying some nice moral things that we can later on look back on and be, hey, he's got a point. That was a good parable. He just kind of happened to be doing those things because they're true things. They're things that he wanted to talk about when he was given the opportunity. But on his to-do list when he came to earth was probably not ooh, preach this sermon and make these points. And that was obviously part of it, but to whittle his whole life down to just his teachings is not grasping the whole picture. So I think reducing him, like Lewis says, to mere moral teaching is ignoring a lot of the other things that he did. And the things that really set him apart and made the Pharisees kind of scared of him is the Pharisees were initially just viewing him as a moral teacher. And a lot of the things that he said,
who were the Pharisees? What are we?
The Pharisees were the Jews, basically, most elite of the Jews that were very adamant about the law and how we should live our lives and kind of keeping to that. And when Jesus comes along, he's also a Jew, so they should agree on a lot of things. But Jesus is making these claims that Lewis talks about how he said that he had the ability to forgive sins, which only God can do, because the sin isn't against this person, it's against God. So how would you have the authority to forgive somebody's sins against something that you weren't involved in? So when Jesus was forgiving people's sins, the Pharisees were like, whoa, you can't do that. And he's like, actually, I can, because I'm God himself. And they're like, what? That's crazy. And so Jesus explicitly says many times that he is God, that he's the Son of God, that he has this authority. And to separate that from his teachings and hang on to just the teachings and reject what he's saying about being the son of God, it's like, well, you can't really pick and choose what you want.
Yeah, you're saying like he has to be both or
right
part, and that's kind of where Lewis was. Actually, that makes a little bit more sense, I think, and it's my rational brain is going, well, he could have been deceitful, he could have been deluded, but I get your point, I think.
And he doesn't it's not just words either. So that kind of combination of like the morals that he's teaching, the claims that he's making about being God, and then the inexplainable miracles he's able to do are kind of this trifecta of not just of like validating his claims as God and therefore being viewed as someone who is telling the truth. And then if that person is telling the truth, then their teachings are something that you care to listen to. But if you think they're a liar, why would you listen to their teachings?
Yeah, and that's kind of how he put it. I just need to wrap my head around it a little bit. I want to touch on the moral law again, and I think this was the main point that converted him from an atheist to a Christian. He said, we can argue that God exists by the very fact that all humans believe that there is a standard of morality in the universe. I was saying earlier that I don't think that morality is unique to humans. I think other relatively intelligent animals have morality as well. It's just we can't really observe it. But even on that note, I think there are a shitload of humans that don't have any morality. I mean, there are certainly a lot of psychopaths out there. There are, I mean, different cultures agree on different things. Cultures go to war over religion.
Mm-hmm.
There are some, there's some really bad stuff going on in the world where some people are doing some really sick things. I'm deciding whether or not to say it out loud, but killing infants is just for fun. Like it's really, really messed up shit. So that morality, I don't think is, it doesn't apply to all humans, kind of as he was saying, and I'm sure he understands that having been in the war, but I don't know if it's fair to say that all humans have morality when it's clear that they don't.
I mean, I think he does definitely mention that disclaimer that there are exceptions. Like there are mental illnesses that cause people to be psychopaths and have no compassion on others whatsoever. I don't think that is the norm. It definitely exists, but I think he's speaking very generically, and I do think that he does a good job of kind of towing the line of, I'm not saying that every cultural value is the same. I'm not saying that there's not gray area and that something that one person thinks is wrong, another person thinks is okay. I think he's generally speaking on like human virtues. And I think a lot of things that cause people to do evil are based on who they think to be the enemy. But like, you're my brother, you're not, I mean, hopefully not my enemy. So the virtues that I have for how I treat you, hopefully is like,
well, that's another point, is that it's more of a social standard, and it's kind of everyone's desire to get people to like you. I mean, not to be rude to our other brother, but he has, mild autism where it's difficult to understand social cues, and you're much more apt to be saying what you're thinking instead of using a filter. So I think when we talk about morality, it's more about social acceptance as opposed to, I mean, think about, and maybe this is, I bet it's different for you than for me, but I bet a lot of people would do much worse stuff if they know it wouldn't affect them in any way. Or like, I bet much more people would be criminals if they knew they wouldn't get caught. But they choose not to because of the potential consequences.
So your question is like, is morality just based off of?
I think it's largely based off of social situations. Yeah,
that's an interesting.
I mean, imagine how often, or this happens in my business a lot, when you go shake a guy's hand and really you're thinking, go fuck yourself. It's you really do not. It's, you have dinner with people you hate all the time. You try to be polite, but you have all these thoughts in your head about how much you dislike the person you're sitting across from, and you got to restrain yourself a little bit. And that could be for any number of reasons.
Yeah, I mean, it's great and it's tricky, but I think his point is that, especially like, it's a nature versus nurture thing. So his claim is that morality and the things that we value are and know are right or wrong are not exclusively environmental and due to our upbringing and our culture, but that there are undeniable things that we do inherently by our nature know to be right or wrong or unfair or whatever. It's kind of hard to know where one ends and the other one starts. So I see what you're saying, where there are a lot of things that can be, like, a lot of morality things that can be explained away by evolution or by social advantage or by social acceptance or things like that. But I also think that there are a number of things that cannot be explained away by that. And I think it's part of obviously to Lewis, this is like a really, really, really big part of the argument. But I think there's probably more to the argument than just that too. So okay. I don't know. I think the fact that we feel guilt when nobody prompts us to feel guilt, or
yeah, that's true.
Like, we know that we did something wrong, even if we didn't get caught.
Clearly, some dogs feel guilt, like if they tear up a pillow while their owner's away. Then you walk.
But if their owner never rebukes them for doing that before, would they?
Yeah, true. But I think they know as well. I mean, I'm sure you've seen a lot of the videos online. I certainly hope that the owners don't actually abuse the dog, but they, even like our old dog, right? Like he knew when he did something wrong. He cry in a corner. Transitioning a little bit here, and again, my struggle with the book, though good book, by the way, I do like it. I certainly recommend it. It's more of a focus on what Christians believe, as opposed to convincing people to believe. That being said, though, and I think along with a lot of the discussions we've had, I very much agree with what he has to say about Christianity. And there's a paragraph from his book that I want to read here, if you don't mind. Mm-hmm. This is after a conversation about chastity and sex, but he says, "Finally, though I have had to speak at some length about sex, I want to make it as clear as I possibly can that the center of Christian morality is not here. If anyone thinks that Christians regard unchastity as the supreme vice, he is quite wrong. The sins of the flesh are bad, but they are the least bad of all sins. All the worst pleasures are purely spiritual. The pleasure of putting other people in the wrong, of bossing and patronizing and spoiling sport and backbiting. The pleasures of power, of hatred. For there are two things inside me competing with the human self which I must try to become. They are the animal self and the diabolical self. The diabolical self is the worst of the two, and this is the part that I agree with. That is why a cold, self-righteous prig who goes regularly to church may be far nearer to hell than a prostitute. But of course, it's better to be neither." So we've talked about that, where you could be a devout churchgoer who's kind of a self-righteous ass, and you have this, a regular person just trying to get by who's not as doomed to hell as some people lead them to believe. Mm-hmm. So I do want to make that point. I mean, any comments on that, how some devout Christians might be, I don't know if they'd be a devout Christian, but in Lewis's mind, that's not going to church isn't a ticket to heaven.
Absolutely.
Right. That's a point that he made that I really agree with.
Right. And I think he said that really beautifully, and I love how he knits words together. And I think it's a really cool gift that God gave C.S. Lewis to repeat a lot of the things that the Bible talks about, but in a way that's almost more intellectually stimulating, or gives it a little bit of a boost and more wordiness that helps you understand it. But with that said, I don't think that this paragraph that you just read is an original idea to him. I think that that's really clear in the Bible, because in Jesus's life,
I think he just articulates it a lot better.
He does. Yeah. I appreciate how he takes a concept and then extrapolates on it.
Yeah. He's not afraid to use English. The Bible is much more cryptic, it seems.
It's also
2,000 years
probably
old.
the original languages that it was written in. Just
Yeah.
the translation aspect probably simplifies things a bit. Who knows? But I was going to say, like, just how, if you look at Jesus' life and who he rebukes, it's those who are prideful, the Pharisees, the religious ones. And in Mere Christianity, I think it talks about pride being the great sin.
Yeah, and I was going to ask about that, so remind me when we finish up here. But that's something I don't know if I completely agree with. I mean, I think his point was that too much pride kind of puts yourself above God. But by itself, I don't want to think of pride as a necessarily bad thing.
Yeah, I think
you should be proud of
a little bit about like what pride is and what pride is not.
Okay.
And it talks about, let's see, let me just read a couple lines that I underlined talking about it. He says, "It is through pride that the devil became the devil. Pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. Pride is the comparison that makes you proud, the pleasure of being above the rest." It says that pleasure in being praised is not pride. The word like to be proud of somebody is not being prideful, or to feel like somebody is proud of you does not mean that you're prideful.
I might have misunderstood that a little bit then, because like you should be proud of your friends, your family, your kids, kind of in a way to support them.
Right. Yeah, I think proudness, like in the way that we think about it in some aspects, is like to honor somebody, and in honoring somebody, like you are elevating in some way that person or yourself. But yeah, I think pride in the sense that he's talking about here is like a complete lack of humility, and therefore a complete putting down of anybody who disagrees with you or tries to put you down or anything like that. So going back to that passage that you just read, I think that's very emulated in how Jesus interacts with the Pharisees, and then also how he interacts with other people. So in his life, I just watched the episode of The Chosen where he's interacting with the woman at the well, who by many interpretations, like is kind of not necessarily a prostitute, but an adulteress, has had many different husbands. Like
which show did you say?
The Chosen. It's
okay. Sorry.
Yeah, I think I've talked about it with you. But anyway, the scene in the Bible, or the passage of the Bible, is Jesus talking to the Samaritan woman at the well. And so she's basically this like quote unquote sexually immoral person, but she's not prideful. She's just broken. Like this is a product of her circumstance, that she has been in these different relationships. And when she comes face to face with Jesus, she humbles herself before him and says, and isn't like, aha, don't tell me what I did wrong, and I don't believe you are who you say you are, and stuff like that. So pride like keeps you away from God more so than other sins that maybe you're just like subject to, or that you know are a mistake but you do anyway. They don't necessarily keep you away from God. They just like are one more way to reveal your that reveals your brokenness. Whereas pride is just like an absolute refusal to humble yourself.
Okay. And I respect that. I think, again, that's well put. How I don't know what all 7 deadly sins are off the top of my head. Again, I've probably done them all today. But it just seems odd that he would put... Maybe the way he explains it, because I think maybe it's just because I understand pride to be something else. But he says it's the worst of the sins, but considering it seems like he has a slightly definition, maybe it does make more sense in his head. So that's fair. I want to talk about another point that I very much agree with is he very much defends the notion of marriage. And that's awesome. Like I totally respect that. I think he kind of I might be paraphrasing, but he made it sound like once you're bonded together in marriage, you're kind of one soul. Again, I don't know if those are the exact words that he used, but you kind of become one in that process. And after you become one, you can't really be separated, I think. So I forgot if he actually mentioned divorce at all. I also haven't read The Great Divorce yet, so I don't know if that has anything to do with it at all.
The Great Divorce is actually not about like human divorce.
Okay, I would have expected
more about like our divorce from God.
But yeah, he's. I don't think he would have explicitly said something like, "Oh, if you get a divorce, you're going to hell." But I think he kind of mentioned that it puts a strain on you a little bit, if that makes sense. I don't know if you saw any of that in your little summary research over the last couple of days, but that is something that I agree with.
Also, side note: C.S. Lewis was divorced, and
was he? Okay,
so that probably paints his perspective a little bit.
Well, it's also different when. Well, I don't know if that was the case, but if someone dies at the beginning of the book, I thought he said he'd never married, but maybe he just.
Or wait a second, let me see.
Yeah, are you sure? I thought.
Wait a second. No. Wait a second. I'm confused. I'm asking ChatGPT.
If you don't know it, I did have some follow-ups here, but I just want to pay respect to the points that I do agree with him on.
Well, wait a second. Wait a second. I can't quite totally remember. I thought that it was a divorce. ChatGPT is describing it as marital separation, but she died, so I don't know. I'm confused. It talks about this in A Grief Observed, which I just read, and it's really depressing, but great book where C.S. Lewis is discussing grief in light of his wife's passing. She had cancer. They were only married for like not a very long time at all, maybe like a year or something. Don't quote me on that. But anyway, great book. Side note, I thought that it had mentioned something in there about divorce. Maybe he would just remarried at one point. I can't remember.
Okay, I thought he said he didn't, but again, maybe I'm misunderstanding. Somebody can fact check us here, but I think he did mention that in the book. Is like I can.
Oh, never mind. He did not remarry.
He didn't remarry, implying that he was married.
No, he didn't remarry after the death of his wife that died from cancer.
Okay, so he was married at one point, though. Okay, so
yes,
he was. I think he wrote the book after. After that, then.
Which book?
The Mere Christianity.
Oh,
he must have. It was published in 1952, which, by the way, I think the book was based on like a series of radio broadcasts that he did. So it was kind of in the works because he was much more eloquent than most people in explaining his beliefs.
And sorry, just another fact check. It looks like she died in 1960, so it was written before.
Okay.
Maybe before they even met.
Okay, I mean, yeah, that could be.
Because A Grief Observed is really interesting, which you should also read, because obviously Mere Christianity, Lewis approaches Christianity with this like confidence and this intellectualism and kind of making sense of why one would justify Christianity and what the morals are and why those morals make sense. And then A Grief Observed is kind of like him coming to ends where like his faith isn't improving his grief. He's kind of criticizing the Christian nice little tie up in a bow way to approach grief, where it's like, oh, it's okay, you'll see them in heaven, or oh, like they're in a better place and stuff like that. And basically his whole book is like, that doesn't make it any better. That actually kind of sucks. And I hate that is how we simplify death. And let's not use Christianity as a way to like lighten grief and darkness. And anyway, it's just interesting kind of coming from this place of like, yay, Christianity, this is why I believe it, why I'm so confident in it, to a point where he's just at the end of his rope in a sense. And he's like, man, this sucks. And like, my faith is little consolation to me, but I still have it. It's really interesting.
While we're on the point, I'm trying to get something to load here on my other screen because it's something funny that I feel obligated to share. We talked about how he defends the notion of marriage, and again, that's great. Generally, I believe people, of course, like I'm proud of my friends who are married. I really want those kinds of things to last. I don't think you should get a divorce, with the exception of maybe some very unordinary circumstances. But it happens. I'm wondering, I don't think he touched on it explicitly. I mean, maybe beyond what we've already said. But in the book, if you remember, maybe within the Bible, how does it explain the concept of like sex, premarital sex? And for the record, I don't judge this stuff at all. If you're out there, if you're a prostitute, I mean, like, good for you. It's your job. You're just doing your job. I'm not here to judge. It's none of my freaking business. But what does it say on the subject that you're aware of? I don't even know if the Bible commented on that directly, or if it's just something Christians kind of extrapolated.
I mean, the Bible does certainly talk a lot about adultery, and the definition of adultery is sleeping with somebody that's not your spouse, which would be your boyfriend or somebody that you're quote unquote dating. But it does get kind of tricky when our cultural concept of dating is a lot different than the cultural concept of marriage at the time. So like a modern day person might know and be more emotionally connected or know their boyfriend better than somebody 2,000 years ago knew their spouse that maybe they met the day before they got married because it was arranged or things like that. So I see why it's like tricky in today's cultural context where you're like, oh, well, it's about the actual commitment and the love more than it is about the legalness of it. But I think the difference between marriage and like a dating relationship as we view it today is that level of commitment. And the Bible does talk a lot about marriage being a metaphor for our relationship with Christ. And it talks about like what God has joined together, let no one separate. So it is kind of this like final committed, only your spouse type of relationship, as opposed to how we view it today, where it's like, oh, you date this person, you're sleeping with them, you break up, and then you date this other person, you sleep with them, you break up. And then it's kind of quote unquote infidelity all over the place because all those people did not end up being your spouse. And if you do get married, you will have slept with plenty of people that are not your spouse.
Yeah, and I'm not saying, like, I mean, I don't like the idea of being a whore. Like, there's a bit of a line here. Like, I'm not saying people should go out or do this or whatever. I'm emphasizing that, like, I don't judge. I've made my fair share of stupid mistakes here too. Like, I feel like a lot of people do, but it's also feeling your feelings, kind of exploring. And a lot of people are in very passionate relationships early on. And they don't pan out the way you imagine, which sucks. But again, I do genuinely support the notion of marriage, as he pointed out. Maybe
sorry, just to interrupt real quick off the top of your head so I can follow along. Do you happen to remember which chapter it is that he talks about it, or if you have a specific page number? I forgot.
I have the PDF open so I can Control F some stuff.
Good.
Let's see. He also calls sadism a sexual perversion, which
is that like enjoying
getting off by inflicting pain upon others.
Oh, I think I agree with it.
Well, hang on. Not to get into like some kinky stuff here, but if it is,
I'm not experienced. I'm a virgin and I'm waiting till marriage. Just
okay. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to go into this, but
I'm just saying that I won't totally understand what you're talking about.
So I was going to say that.
No, obviously, I have bias.
Well, say you are married, and your partner is a sadist, and the receiving participant is into that. Like, you're married, and it's together in a bedroom behind closed doors, and it's 100% consensual. I don't see any problem with that. Like, it's what happens behind two closed doors of consenting adults is none of my business. I don't know. I have some friends that are into that, so I try not to judge. But
Okay.
Sorry.
Interesting. I mean, I also want to be like open to not just being like, like it needs to be the most vanilla, like.
Okay, Sam, I didn't mean to go into a deep conversation about.
But I was just gonna note, I was just listening to a podcast about like purity culture, which is kind of a buzzword in Christianity, and getting a bit of pushback. So basically, like purity culture has kind of arisen from quote unquote Christian values, and it goes a lot beyond just like, oh, don't have sex till you get married, but kind of going into like sexual ethics when you're dating and how far is too far, and oh, if you do this, then you're in sin, or oh, you should feel guilty if you're like French kissing your partner that you're dating, or oh, in marriage, if you wait till
wait.
People have all sorts of different standards, but I have friends that like didn't kiss until they were on the altar, which is I did not do that. I think that's
first of all, that's impressive, but
some people do, because
that's fine, but I respect that restraint. Holy crap.
I know. Honestly, I do too. I'm like, I wish I could, and I didn't. I'm not as, I guess I give in to my desires more than that, and I don't think that's wrong. I feel fine about kissing Kenny. But anyway, so just talking about like how extreme this perception of like purity culture is, and how it kind of creates these myths that like, ooh, if you save yourself for marriage, your sex life in marriage is going to be so great, and like all this stuff. And maybe part of that is founded, but I just think that the rules that we put around sexuality in Christianity, they're not supposed to be rules for the sake of rules. It's more supposed to be, and that's Christianity in general, is just like not rules for the sake of rules, but rather wisdom and values that influence the choices that you make. And so what values do you have that influence your sexual ethic as a Christian beyond just, oh, somebody told me I'm not supposed to have sex before I get married?
Well, it's a personal choice for a lot of people, as you said, and I respect that, and I apologize. And I didn't mean for you to go into details about your personal life like that. I was going to show this scene that I was trying to find on my other screen here. Have you seen the movie A Million Ways to Die in the West?
Yes.
Seth MacFarlane, you know it?
Yes.
It takes place in the Old West. There's this couple, I think they're like devout Christian or Catholic or something, and the girl in this relationship is a whore at this what do you call it, like the old Midwest tavern? What's the Western term?
The saloon?
Saloon, yeah. She's a prostitute at a saloon, and she's getting railed 10 times a day. But between her and her husband, she's trying to save it for marriage.
He doesn't know.
Which, like, it's kind of cool because it's a joke, but at the same time, I respect the concept. Which again is why I don't judge prostitutes. And like how C.S. Lewis was saying, there could be a prostitute who's closer to heaven than a prig who goes to church every week.
Right. Another thing, this is also delving into this topic of sex, which is really, honestly, I'm into talking about it. But I think you're a guy, I'm a girl. Experiences of sex are different. So I also want to provide the perspective that, like, in general, and this might not always be true, but I feel like in general, when I think of a prostitute, I feel more bad for them. I
think of it as someone who's trying to get by, and that's why I generally have like more respect than judgment for something like that.
Absolutely, yeah. I think of them more as the victim than the perpetrator.
Yeah.
As a prostitute, I'm like, there's sex trafficking. There's all kinds of awful reasons that you get into that, and I think of that situation more as like a hurt to be healed than a sin to be corrected. And I think that's how Jesus interacts with prostitutes that he meets in the Bible. And especially in that time, like, women are oppressed today, but back then probably even more so. And I think Jesus had a lot of compassion on that rather than just like, wow, you're a whore, like, we need to criticize you.
I doubt Jesus would have used that language.
No, he would not.
Whoa, you're not in.
So anyway, I think Jesus sees in a lot, I mean, obviously sin oftentimes is like our fault, and then there's also a lot of scenarios where we're like the victims of sins that have perpetuated throughout history, or like by small decisions in our own life that led us to this place that we never thought we'd be. And I think that God has, and Jesus in his life has compassion on those things and sees them as hurts to be healed rather than sins to be corrected. Although it can be both.
Okay. And I like that point again, which leads me into another discussion. But before we get there, that was going to lead me into the Screwtape Letters. There is another thing that stood out to me that C.S. Lewis mentioned in Mere Christianity, which was, if you give yourself over to God, he's not just going to fix the parts of you that you want him to fix. He's going to fix all of you, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
The example that he used was when he was a young kid, he used to have a toothache, and he'd be reluctant to go to his mom because he had no doubt that she would give him an aspirin or whatever the 1950s version of that was to suppress the pain a little bit. He liked that part, but he also knew that the next day he was going to be going to the dentist to get it completely fixed, which he didn't want because he hated going to the dentist. I mean, who doesn't? But it's an interesting point that he made, where if you're going to give yourself over to God, he's going to fix all of you. Maybe can you expand on that just a little bit? Just because I'm a stubborn person like myself. Yeah, I have a lot of flaws, but there's some stuff I would be probably resistant to change. But I'm just curious kind of how you think about something like that.
Yeah, and I think it's absolutely great that he brings that up, because I think that's a central thing that sometimes perceptions of Christianity don't emulate that well, or that is mistaught in the church, is portraying Christianity as behavior correction rather than transformation. And behavior correction is a set of rules where you're like, hey, don't have sex before marriage, don't get drunk, don't blah, 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 blah. Like all this stuff is just behavior correction. It's just pinpointing those behaviors and telling you not to do them, or giving you a to-do list like, oh, you need to tithe, or you need to go volunteer to soup kitchen. Or it's not a list of do's and don'ts. It is a development of your character as your like human fleshly spirit is slowly being overtaken or sanctified by God's spirit, and that influences sort of what you're becoming and how you approach various issues, rather than just like making sure that you're following the rules. And so anyway, I don't know if that is exactly getting at what you were saying with the like, you want to hold on to certain things, because it's not like, oh, I want to improve my life in this way, this way, and this way, so I'll become a Christian, but I'm going to hang on to these things. It is giving yourself up to be prepared for whatever change God wants to instill in you, not to just follow all of his rules, but to have his spirit to inform how you approach life in a different way. And it's not black and white, it's gray. And I think C.S. Lewis does a really good job of that. He talks about, what does he say? Like page 119, I think I underlined. I thought it was an interesting point. He says, like, all killing is not murder any more than all sexual intercourse is adultery. Kind of the like, there's a time and place for everything, and it really, and it like, you really can't just rely on a set of do's and don'ts. You have to rely on the spirit that is in you and guiding you.
Okay, and I like that, kind of as we were saying. I like the idea more that there's an exception to everything. I certainly agree with that. So that's fair.
Yeah. Have you read Ecclesiastes yet?
No, was that one of his?
It's in the Bible. It's a book of the Bible.
No.
I'll bring my Bible to Thanksgiving and you can read it. It's pretty short.
I gotta finish my finance book first.
Okay.
Sam convinced me to wear my finance bro sweater, by the way. So
we're both repping.
Go Rams!
Alma mater. Go Rams!
Let me pull up the rest of my notes here, because I think that does take us to the next point.
I think there was also something that I wanted to
Well, and I'm sure the general point he mentioned in Mere Christianity, but this is kind of my lead into the Screwtape Letters, which is about, well, Mere Christianity, and generally speaking, Christians will say you need to avoid temptation. Resisting temptation is a good thing. That's another point that he made in Mere Christianity, which I 100% agree with, which is also part of Stoic philosophy, by the way. Mm-hmm. So I know whenever I mention Stoic philosophy to you, the first thought that goes to your head is, it's all about resisting and suppressing your emotions, which is completely inaccurate. But that is a point that overlaps between that philosophy and Christianity, which I think is, I would 100% agree with that. So are you ready if we just dive briefly into Screwtape Letters here?
I think I wanted to just read one other passage that relates to the more like character building, becoming part of Christianity as opposed to just like the rule following. Page 92, he says, people often think of Christian morality as a kind of bargain in which God says, if you keep a lot of rules, I'll reward you. And if you don't, I'll do the other thing. I do not think that is the best way of looking at it. I would much rather say that every time you make a choice, you are turning the central part of you, the part of you that chooses, into something a little different from what it was before. And taking your life as a whole, with all your numerable choices, all your life long, you are slowly turning the central thing either into a heavenly creature or into a hellish creature, either into a creature that is in harmony with God or with other creatures and with itself, or else into one that is in a state of war and hatred with God and with its fellow creatures and with itself. To be the one kind of creature is heaven, that is, it is joy and peace and knowledge and power. To be the other means madness, horror, idiocy, rage, impotence, and eternal loneliness. Yes. Each of us at each moment is progressing to the one state or other.
Agreed, and that's the perfect transition for this because I have almost...
Exactly. So, I think it's a good transition to Screwtape. Sure.
Yes, so I have the slide up here. So Screwtape Letters, also written by C.S. Lewis, a series of letters, fictional, of course, written from the point of view of a demon to his nephew, Wormwood. And it's all about this demon trying to show how you can use temptation to lure regular people away from God. Mm-hmm. And the point, this is the same point, different wording, but one of the quotes that stuck out to me, very similar to what you just said. Indeed, the safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts. So Lewis emphasizes the complacency of gradual moral decline and how it's not about one big or small thing that determines your fate. It's all these tiny choices you're making day to day. If you're constantly giving into temptation, you don't hold back at all. You're moving further away from God. Mm-hmm. I think that's a good way to explain it. And I agree with the way he put it, which is it's more about how you live your life and make these little choices as opposed to anything larger. Any further comments on that?
Yeah, I really liked that about the Screwtape Letters. That was kind of a not necessarily a new concept, but something that I didn't think about that much at the time of reading it. And I thought it was really valuable to be like, wow, I should be just as on guard of the everyday things that are turning me, like C.S. Lewis describes, away from God. And those superimposed in each other for years and years and years and years can end you up in a place that you don't want to be. So just sort of making a bigger deal out of these seemingly small things that are leading you the other direction. I think it's an excellent book that I think.
And admittedly, it was kind of hard for me to
and also, sorry, go ahead.
As I just said, like as a book, I didn't like it as much as Mere Christianity. I mean, it was fine. It was just harder for me to grasp everything. And it's written kind of a satirical language, little old-fashioned style, so it's a little hard to comprehend all of it. But this is the general principle. That was one thing that stood out.
Mm-hmm.
But
I like how he talks about the non-obvious things like being distracted or being busy, or he gives lots of examples that are just things that you wouldn't normally think about, like complacency. I mentioned distraction, pride, materialism, more focus on the pleasures of life rather than like building your character or your virtues.
Yeah, and as a well, I don't think there's anything wrong with pleasure. I mean, I certainly think you should be living life to the fullest and generally living with. I mean, explore pleasure without giving into constant temptation. But I mean, you should enjoy yourself. You want to have a good, fulfilling life without being completely hedonistic. That's a word, right?
I think so. I agree with you. I think, obviously, I don't think Christianity is opposed to enjoyment of life. Like, there's plenty of passages. I mean, there are plenty of passages that are like, die to yourself and reject the desires of your flesh and take all your thoughts captive and all this stuff. However, there are also plenty of verses that are like, hey, I've come to give you life and life to the full, or I'm a good father and I know how to give good gifts to my children, or I know there's nothing better for people to do than to be happy and do good while they live. Like, Christianity is not anti-happiness. It's just the recognition that there's a lot more to life than temporary pleasures and that true joy is found in God.
Okay. And in fairness and kind of bouncing back to mere Christianity, I think that was a point that Lewis made talking about his conversion from atheism to Christianity is he found much more joy in his life after he accepted God.
Mm-hmm.
So that is an interesting point. Another hold up, and I don't want to I'm committing a sin here or being eroded because I'm mixing my attention between two subjects, right? But a point in mere Christianity that I forgot to mention, and now am I really blanking on it? What was it? It'll come back to me. It will. Sorry, I had it on the tip of my tongue. I'll find it. But yeah, the Screwtape Letters were very, very interesting. And I think it kind of relates to, we talked a few weeks ago about how humanity is kind of moving further and further away from God. I think it's generally accepted, and even I'll say that, out loud and without being a devout Christian, is, I think humanity is drifting further and further away from God. It seems like people are giving into their temptations more and more, especially with the advent of technology. And I'm all about technological progress, but we live in an age where you could have pretty much anything you ever want at your fingertips, which is cool in some ways, and then in other ways, it's a little Black Mirror-y.
Right. I feel like it kind of goes along with great power comes great responsibility. And as we develop as a nation, and not just us, but other countries too, there's a lot more things for Satan to use to drive us away from God. And he's certainly using those things. And I feel like that can be used for good or for bad. Like living in Cambodia for a semester, the level of like technological advancement and materialism and entitlement is definitely not the same as it is in the US. And I think that is appropriate, or I think that is a bit of a better environment to become. Well, I guess there's pros and cons, obviously, but those types of challenges aren't facing the Christians in Cambodia at the same rate that they're facing the Christians in the US. There's obviously different challenges in both, like being the predominant religion here and not being the predominant religion in Cambodia and stuff like that. So each culture has its own vices. But anyway, yeah, I mean, I think that we can also talk about this more in the future, but the Babylon is the nation the Bible talks a lot about as being like the most advanced, the most rich, the most prideful and entitled nation, and how they are like the most godless people because they have all this earthly stuff and yet they're completely missing out on God because of that. And I think that is kind of what we're growing into.
Okay. And sorry, I want to interrupt while I have the thoughts. This is what I was going to say a couple minutes ago that I forgot. Now I'm remembering. but Lewis mentioned it in Mere Christianity that a holdup for so many people, and I think I've been repetitive about this on our older episodes, that how could God exist if bad things happen constantly? And I've said that's really not a holdup for me. The fact that there's war and bad shit happens all the time, and you don't constantly get what you want, that's not actually something that makes me not believe. Because I think people are, if we had that, we wouldn't really have free will.
Right.
I would rather have free will and have the ability to make my own decisions than have everything I possibly want handed to me all the time. I think that's a tremendous value. And then Lewis kind of talks about that, oh, well, there's all this shit, but then again, like, what's my baseline here? There's nothing you could possibly compare it to. So it's not fair to say that God doesn't exist when all this bad shit is happening. When we're like, okay, well, compared to what?
Right.
It's difficult to explain. Obviously, he articulated a lot better. Of course, why we're kind of recommending the book here. But I do want to emphasize that point because that is another thing I very much agreed with him on.
Absolutely. I think that's a very valid question and also a very valid response to that very common question. And I think it's like, well, which one do you want? Do you want to have free will? Do you want to have the ability to love? Because that's going to come with the ability to hate. And do you want to have the ability to do good? Because that's going to come with the ability to do evil. And the magnitude is matched on either end. And
right, we asked for freedom. We got freedom. We're able to make our own choices.
Absolutely.
So I agree with that. Anyway, Sam, any further points you want to make here? I think we hit on the main points and then we kind of zigzagged here. So apologies for anybody listening, but any other closing remarks before I get into a couple of my... It wouldn't be a full podcast without me showing some memes. So
right. I do want to see your memes. I feel like I have one question. I know that your main takeaway from all of this, at least this is what it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that these two books, and especially Mere Christianity, were very intellectually stimulating and made a lot of good points and did a good job explaining what Christians believe. But your holdup is like, okay, this explains what they believe, but it doesn't necessarily convince me.
Right.
Or it doesn't focus. It's not like written to the non-Christian trying to make a case. Were there things about it that you do feel like made a valid case or that like inched you any more towards a non-agnostic view and more of like, oh, maybe this faith has a point kind of view?
Inched me to it, sure. I mean, I could say reading the Bible would probably inch me toward it more. I don't know if there's anything in particular aside from what I've already mentioned, which is the fact that he did start out, I don't know if he was explicitly an atheist. Maybe he was, but
I think he was.
Similar to my position where he crosses over. I've said this before, how I hear more stories about atheists converting to Christianity than Christians converting to atheists. So I want to emphasize that, and this is no offense to you, of course, but like when I hear it from him, I give it a little bit more weight.
As you should.
I don't think you've ever been atheist or agnostic, or at least questioning to the same extent that I am. Whereas he was at one point, and on top of that, he served, like we said, in the trenches. He has seen horrors beyond my comprehension that can really influence your belief. So that I will say that. I know I've said it before, but as far as anything in particular, nothing that stands out. Again, good book. I'm not criticizing it. The fact that the Gospels were coherent and there's other evidence to back it up. We touched on that a little bit, but we already knew that. So I don't know if it moved me any closer. Let's say on a scale of 0 to 100, with 0 being atheist, like completely not believing in God, 100 being devout Christian, I know he's real. If I were a 50, I'd say the book would have pushed me like a 52, 53 maybe.
Okay.
Hey, that's progress, right? That's something.
Hey, there you go.
So again, not criticizing it, but it's like going to church. Like, okay, I've heard this story before, and he articulates it so much better than almost anything else I've ever read. But I do need to understand the transition more. If that.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like based on your response, not a lot of this was new news to you.
Right. I think he explained it so much better than I've heard, though. So that's where I'm trying to give absolute credit where credit is due.
Right. It extrapolates on your existing view of Christianity and hopefully aids that a little bit and maybe confirms some perspectives that you already had, which is good. And yeah, I think obviously this podcast, it talks a lot about like the intellectual side of Christianity or answering questions. One thing I just want to mention is that one of the things that the Screwtape Letters talks about as like something to draw us away from God is thinking about him as purely intellectual. So I'm just going to read the ChatGPT explanation. Says Screwtape advises Wormwood to encourage the patient to study Jesus in a purely intellectual historical sense without allowing the patient to recognize the personal and divine significance of Christ. By teaching Jesus as a mere historical figure or philosopher, the patient will miss out on the transformative power of a relationship with the real living Christ. So obviously we're talking about it a lot intellectually. That only gets you so far. So one thing that we obviously don't do on this podcast is like the more personal reflection of it and what that looks like. And that's something that is more kind of on you to explore. But not to say that the historical and the intellectual parts aren't important. I think those are good and can definitely spur on desire for knowing God. But I think that is a missing piece that like we can't necessarily do here in the same way.
Yeah, and another thing I'll mention as we're wrapping it up here, a lot of non-believers have said things like, if God exists, why haven't we seen his full power? And then he goes into saying, well, the Christians believe sooner or later you will witness the full wrath of God, which is the rapture, right?
Mm-hmm.
So right. I think we did a little teaser at the end of episode 5 where we said we'd talk about the rapture. So apologies. We didn't really go into detail, but that is something he mentioned. And as he emphasizes, and a lot of other Christians, it seems, even though I've said praying like hell on your deathbed seems to work, they make the point that you got to be ready.
Yeah.
It could happen anytime. And as we're drifting away further and further away from God, as we've said, I agree with that. Maybe the rapture is getting closer and closer. I guess we will see.
Yeah, it was, again, I was just watching an episode of The Chosen, which I've gotten more into recently. I hadn't really watched it much, but I've had a lot of free time in the evenings, and that's kind of like the show that I'm trying to get into. And one of the things that this passage is in the Bible, but it was interesting to see it portrayed in the show, where somebody's asking Jesus, like, oh, I know that this is going to happen, and like the Messiah is going to come back and he's going to separate the wicked from the righteous and kind of restore everything. Like, when is that going to happen? And Jesus didn't answer her question, but instead he answered the question with a story, and he was like,
that's what's annoying about the Bible.
He doesn't answer questions.
Give me a freaking answer instead.
No, but stories are timeless, and the way that he answers it is really interesting. Yeah. So it's like, okay, if you're a worker and you know that your boss is coming back at some point, but he doesn't tell you when. If he told you when, you'd probably slack off, like, or your mom is coming home and you don't know when she's going to come home. And if you did, you would just kind of be like, oh crap, mom's gonna be home in 5 minutes. Let's like clean the house and kind of get our stuff together. But if you didn't know when she was going to come home, and it could be any second, you're prepared at all times for that. And so in that parable, Jesus is like, hey, I'm not going to tell you when it's going to happen. That's not the point. The point is that you are hopeful and awaiting and anticipating that whenever it may come, and to not put that off to the last minute and just live the way that you want to live. That's not the point. Your full life can start now. It doesn't have to start on your deathbed when you're praying like hell, as you say.
Yeah. Okay, well, some good points. Again, I do want to do an episode on the rapture sooner or later, where I will no doubt show a lot of clips from the fantastic movie This Is the End. There might also be some Simpsons stuff or something built into that. But Sam, as promised, I think I kind of started keeping like a little folder for all the Christian memes that I run into throughout the week. So preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use memes.
Is that what Paul says? Is that Paul right there?
I don't know. You tell me.
At one point he says like, be all things, or I have become all things to all people so that by all means I might save some. Which is basically like, hey, I'm trying to relate to everybody so that I can more effectively share the gospel with them, basically, is kind of how I interpret it. I think that might be what that's making fun of.
Okay, could be. This is the next one. Because I'm obviously a believer in science. Credit, though, plenty of scientists are Christians, but I thought this was funny.
And we should have Kenny on the podcast because that's something that...
Yeah, he's a smart dude, and he does know a lot more about science than I do. So what has bothered me, like I've seen some... I consider these the crazier ones, but I've heard Christians or Catholics who really do not believe in evolution say that, like, well, and then I'll say something like, okay, what about fossils? Like, there is proof that these things were here. And they'll say some shit that's like, oh, well, those were planted by the devil to drag you away from God. I'm like, okay, well, that's
yikes.
Stupid. Yeah, that's one thing where I'm like, yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, we could have a podcast about the different theories of that, but there's like a new Earth versus old Earth theory, and I'm definitely I think on the old Earth team. But I mean, really, it's just kind of an interesting conversation, not necessarily a make or break thing.
This was another sweet one.
Aw, cute. That'll be my kid in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think kids should have principles. That's a cute one. I think this is the last one I had too that you laughed at earlier.
Joseph and Mary. I'm not the stepdad. I'm just the dad that stepped up. Yeah. Maybe Joseph got to heaven and God gifted him that shirt. He's like, thanks, Joseph. Way to be the dad that stepped up. I'm sure he appreciates that.
Yeah.
Joseph seems like a good man.
He does, yeah. Well, you're the stepdad of God. That's got to be a high pressure position.
No kidding.
It's usually the kid trying to get the dad's approval. Now it's the reversing the rules a little bit.
Yeah.
Anyway, Sam, I got my share in here. I didn't have any movie clips this week, even though I was trying to find that Seth MacFarlane clip. Any closing comments here, or do you want to do any prelude to the next episode? Do you think we could do Revelation, or any specific topics coming to mind?
We should chat over Thanksgiving and see what topics are interesting.
Okay, we'll find something. We can get some notes together, but it will be good. And I guess, well, it's going to be December next week, so it's officially Christmas season.
Woo!
Not now, even though I like the Christmas tree, but calm down a little bit. Yes.
I got Christmas radio playing in the background that you probably can't.
Christmas music belongs in December. Maybe we should have an episode on that and just debate for 90 minutes about that. But, okay, well, jokes aside, good talk, Sam. Thank you again for the book. What do you recommend next, by the way, after Mere Christianity and Screwtape Letters? What's the move?
I think The Great Divorce. It's another fictional.
And what's that about?
What was that?
What's that one about?
It's basically about sort of an illustrated version of heaven and hell, or like a creative way to portray heaven and hell. And then sort of the space between the two. And it's just a kind of interesting creative take on what those two things look like. And obviously it's taking creative liberties, but I think that the illustrations that he uses are really fascinating to convey some of the sentiments in those different places. So it's interesting. It's a way to think about heaven and hell, and I think you would like it given your interest in those two things and your questions about them as discussed in previous episodes.
Have you watched that Robin Williams movie yet that I mentioned?
Oh, frick, no. What's it called?
I'm looking for it. What Dreams May Come, I think. It gives a very interesting visualization of heaven. So I recommend it, by the way. It's sad as shit, like a lot of What Dreams May Come, yeah.
Okay.
Like a lot of Robin Williams movies, they're a little sad, but it's a good visualization. I thought they did a
Aw, Robin Williams.
Yeah. But anyway, I think we're kind of closing up here. I don't want to waste anybody's time here. But I hope we hit on the main points here. I hope it went well. I imagine we will talk more about the other books that C.S. Lewis wrote in the future. And we'll find a new topic sometime next week and get another episode in the books here. So again, happy early Thanksgiving, everyone. Get in some time with your family. Hopefully get away.
Share the podcast with family if you're having heated faith conversations with your family, or if you're not, share it with your Christian friends, your non-Christian friends. Yes. Leave topic requests.
But yes, thank you everybody for listening. We appreciate your time. We'll get another episode in the books here, whether that's going to be Revelations or maybe something a little bit more Christmassy.
Ooh, yes, we should do Christmas themes.
Well, we can do that. We'll have a couple episodes next month, presumably. But yes, thank you again, everyone, for listening. Sam, it was a good talk. I really appreciate your time.
I appreciate you reading the books.
Yes, thank you for the books. Appreciate the insight. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We will see you again soon. We'll see you next time.
Bye.